Understanding and mastering this one endgame principle will bring you countless victories. It took me years and hundreds of painful losses to realize this principle, but once I did, my chess level skyrocketed. Today I'm gonna share it with you and show you exactly how to use it in your own games. What's up, chess player? Welcome to the Journey to Grandmaster, the place where you can improve every single aspect of your chess game. Today is a special video because we talk about endgames. That's my favorite topic. I have outplayed so many opponents, especially in the endgame, from a completely equal position, sometimes even worse. And there is a specific strategy I use to achieve that I want to share with you today. It all started here when my student played here queen takes d4. We played a practical game, very instructive endgame here, which I want to share with you how you apply this strategy. So we get this endgame. Initially I'm a pawn down, but this pawn on d3, it's relatively clear that it's not going to survive for long. And I have a knight against the bishop. And this is the first tip I want to give you. You always want to have some kind of an imbalance in the position if you want to outplay your opponent. Because if you both have light squares bishop, for example, you still should try to play for a win, but it's much more difficult because he can just kind of repeat the same things that you do. If you have the knight against the bishop, he has no way to do that. The knight is a completely different piece which handles chess differently. And yes, the bishop is usually stronger than the knight when there are pawns on both sides of the board. But of course, chess is a game of exceptions, and here the pawn structure is a little bit specific. This bishop is not that active. It has no way to penetrate into my camp, at least for now. And pieces activity is probably the most important thing in chess. It doesn't matter how many pieces you have, if they are not active, if they are not participating in the game, who cares? So that's what I planned to use in this game. And another essential point that I want you to remember and take away out of this video, the king's activity is probably the most important thing in the endgame. 99% of the chess players completely ignore the fact that you absolutely have to play with your king in the endgame. The reason why you don't play with it beforehand in the opening and the middle game, because it's dangerous, because with the queens on the board, the king might get into trouble. Well, without the queens, it's almost impossible. Sometimes, again, there might be exceptions, but in most of the cases, you want to use your king and you want to bring it to the action. Normally, it's in the center, but yeah, it might be different. The most important thing, king participates in all of the important actions happening on the board. That should be your goal. My opponent, my student, plays here the move f6. And that is quite a double-edged move. I mean, objectively, this position is equal, and that's what we are trying to understand. How do you actually win in such a situation? Magnus Carlsen is probably the most famous player in the world for converting such an equal endgame into a complete victory. And I have noticed that on my level, I also do it with a pretty good success rate. That is why I wanted to share my strategy with you. So the way Magnus Carlsen wins his endgames, and I try to apply the same strategy, we try to pose as many questions to our opponent as possible. You have to make it complicated for him. You don't want him to take easy decisions. Instead, you want to give him a choice and you want to give him a problem to solve. Because then he feels some pressure and then he might make a mistake. Of course, if our opponent makes everything perfect, then there is nothing we can do. But the more questions we ask, the more pressure we apply on him, the more difficult it's going to be and the higher the chances that he's gonna make a mistake. But how exactly do we do that? So black played f6. I thought it's a little bit helpful for me because I had this weakness. I thought maybe he might attack it in the future, but now since we are just exchanging it, there is no weakness for me anymore and I don't need to care about it. So I feel like he made my position a little bit simpler. And that is, of course, a big deal for me. Now he plays c5, he tries to secure this rook on d4, and yes, I can take the pawn on d3, but it's not gonna go away from me. Again, I don't want to make my opponent's life easy. I want to activate all of my pieces and create some threats for him. That is the most essential part of the strategy. So if I would phrase this one principle in one sentence that I want you to use in every single one of your games after this video, it would be this one. Be patient and apply as much pressure on your opponent as possible. Of course, it's not enough to say that. It's important to implement it the right way on a chess game, so let's learn to do that. I'm playing here knight to c3, for example. I'm creating a threat, knight b5, and that might win a pawn, and it's not clear for my opponent what to do. But instead, if I play rook d3, which is also a fine move, well, then it's much more simpler. He basically either has to take or play 5. He only has two choices. But here, he needs to deal with this threat. It's just the beginning, just the first one. You want to create as many of those threats as possible. Okay, now I ask another question. Do you take it or do you play e5? He went for e5, and I just made him to exchange those rooks. Very instructive point here. He has a light square as bishop, and all of his pawns, except for h7, are on the dark squares. And that's a good thing. This way he controls all sorts of squares. The pawns are controlling the dark squares, whereas the bishop is controlling the light squares. He controls everything. But somehow throughout this endgame, I actually managed to put all of his pawns on the light squares. You are not going to believe how it happened. So first of all, I try to improve my position. I try to create some new opportunities like this b4 move, even though I'm not sure I'm gonna play it, but I just create more chances. Then I'm improving my knight's position. Be patient. That is the most important thing. I realized I need to outplay my opponent in the endgame. So yes, the position is equal. We both understand that, but it's not a draw. It's still a very far way for my opponent to make it. I mean, if he wants, he can play for a win as well. There is nothing against it. In fact, sometimes if your opponent is playing for a win instead of a draw, it gives you more chances because he is active. He has to take risks to create some chances for himself, and that in turn gives chances to you. But you don't want to be in a hurry. You don't want to rush and somehow go those moves that you cannot take back, especially the pawn moves. Always be careful with your pawn moves. You cannot take it back. All right. My opponent played h5. Yeah, this is a very good example. You see that this is the best move according to the engine. The reason is, like, no matter what you do, the engine would say it's 0, 0, 0. That is why it's so hard to learn everything when you analyze such a position with the engine. From a human perspective, these two moves, h5 and h4, helped me a lot because my h4 pawn is now on a dark square. That means that this bishop cannot attack me. Basically, my dream is to put all of my pawns on the dark squares. Then this bishop is more or less useless. It cannot create a threat for me. And I have made sure that his pawn is now on the light square, which might create a problem for him as I might attack it later on. He plays king to f5. I don't allow him any sorts of counterplay. King to e3. He goes back. He realizes that he doesn't really have any active ideas here, and yeah, king f5 wasn't that successful. He goes back, but that means he wastes time. And now for the first time, I do have a little bit of an advantage according to the engine, although the way to get it is not simple. The engine recommends the move g4. I haven't made it, and I guess I wouldn't make it even if I could go back, because it's very tricky. I want you to follow this variation, very instructive. I have calculated that g4 is the most active opportunity for me. I'm creating a passer, so obviously you have to consider such moves. But remember that you never play chess alone. 99% of the chess players make this mistake. What kind of opportunities your opponent has? This is the question you must always and always ask. And you must always start with the most active opportunities, not only for yourself, but also for your opponent. Black can play here the move f5. And I thought, if I play g5, this is not going to be great for me. He can play f4, he can bring his king, and I can only lose here, I feel. So logically, the move should be g takes f, otherwise I just lose a pawn. And the engine claims this position is better for white, but it's so difficult to understand. The right move is knight d5, and then I'm thinking, yeah, black can just stay and wait, and what I'm doing here, the only way to make progress here is to push this h-pawn to deflect the king. But in fact, it's a very small advantage and it's still a draw. That is why I say that if I want to win as white, I don't want to get to here. Yes, I do have some occasional chances, like if black takes here, there would be a fork and I'm gonna win that bishop. But of course, if my opponent is not that stupid, he's not gonna do that and instead activate his bishop. Remember what I said in the beginning, I don't care about my pawns on the light squares as long as this bishop cannot penetrate. Well, guess what? Now it can, and that is a serious problem, the reason why black can make a draw here. And also this move g4 simplifies the position a lot, so it gives my opponent a clarity in terms of what he should do, and I don't want to do that. Remember, do not hurry. I play the move g3 instead. The engine is not happy about it, but from a human perspective, I would argue that's the best way to, well, either g3 or just slowly trying to improve the position is the best way for me to try to get a victory here. Of course, there is no guarantee, but I try my best. I maneuver my knight, and my opponent plays e4. A lot of players have such a strategy. They want to clarify things. They don't want to wait there forever till I bring my knight somewhere here, then I'm gonna prepare the move f4 or b4. I have so many opportunities, and he has just to wait, stay there and wait. It's so difficult, and it might actually backfire and you might lose the game. On the other hand, if you do something like that, well, you're risking putting too many pawns on the light squares I have taken here, as well as creating weaknesses for yourself. Now I'm going back with my knight, and yeah, of course I should not take this guy here on a4. That would be a completely lost endgame. Why? Because my opponent has a passer here, and this pawn structure is very unfortunate for me. If I'm gonna play g4, it might, work out tactically immediately. If, for example, my opponent would need to go for this, yeah, even that is completely winning. But the simplest thing I have calculated during the game, my opponent can play g3, and I wanted to show you because it's very instructive. I can never win those pawns. Now, my opponent, he is still in the square, that is why I cannot promote the pawn, and he is just coming and takes that pawn, and those pawns, they're protecting each other. I can never take this one because this one will promote, and of course I can also not go this way because once I go to f1, he can always play e3, and doesn't matter which side I go, the other pawn goes forward and I lose. So that is a losing game. Every time you exchange pieces in the endgame, you should be very careful what you leave on the board, and especially coming into the pawn endgame, you cannot be too strategic about it. You have to be very concrete. Just calculate the moves. Do I win? Do I lose? What happens here? So I'm, of course, not doing that. Instead, again, I try to apply as much pressure on my opponent as possible. I create yet another threat. The more threats you create, the more chances you have to win the game. Every threat you create is basically another chance to win a game. A little disclaimer here. You don't want to play a so-called hope chess. Hope chess is when you create those one-move threats, but the move is actually not useful for you at all. You are like moving your piece to the other side of the board, and it's not useful there, but you are just doing it for the sake of this one-move threat. No, I want you to make those multi-purpose moves, the best type of moves you can make in chess, where you improve your piece's position and at the same time you create a threat for your opponent. That's what you should be aiming for. Black plays here bishop to c2, creating a counter threat. I have a lot of different opportunities, but again, I look for the way to make my opponent's life as complicated as possible. That is why I take here and then I play knight to c8, because as a result, I create another imbalance in the position. Not only we have knight against the bishop, but now we have separated passers and both pawns can go forward. And in such a situation, I do have some chances for myself. And of course, a nice bonus, I have a distant passer. The more distant your passer is, the more chances you are going to have, because for the king, it's so much more difficult to stop it. Okay, he plays bishop e6. I remaneuver my knight back because I want to control all of the squares to make sure that my opponent doesn't have any counterplay whatsoever. So important. Most of the games are lost because you are not watching out enough for your opponent's ideas and dreams. Don't play as if you're alone on the chessboard. Okay, now I play king e3, and again, it's very complicated. Like, all of a sudden you notice, remember I have warned you about that, all of black pawns are on the light squares, and he has light squares bishop. That's exactly the opposite of what you want to get, because it's so difficult to somehow make use of your bishop now. It's not active, it's a passive defender. And it's very difficult for black to somehow understand what to do here. He makes a mistake here, and that is basically the reason why he loses the game. But it's so complicated. even if the position is still a draw according to the engine. Well, good luck trying to understand all of the nuances and what you should do here. Black played king to e5, and immediately I play knight c3, I cut this king, he cannot do anything, and now my pawn is free to go. And that's exactly what I do, and I want you to remember this principle. First, you want to create a passer in the endgame, or multiple passers if you can, and second, you want to push those passers if it's possible. That's what I'm doing, because the pawn on a3, it's not really dangerous for my opponent. But if you imagine I come to a7, well, then he must remain on this diagonal to cover it, and that, of course, gives me a lot of additional chances. That is why I am pushing it forward all the way to a5, and now my opponent realizes, well, if he does nothing, if he just stays there, I'm gonna just win the game. So he has to create some counterplay. He sacrifices a pawn and plays king f5. The idea is to get here and create a distant passer himself. In a combination with the bishop, it could actually be very dangerous. So I have to be careful with that. But I have came up with a very interesting idea. If you notice, he has created another passer for myself, so technically I have two now. If I can figure out a way to push both of them, then this bishop is not going to be able to control both. And the king, well, it wants to go this way. So I'm playing the move knight to e2, and after king g4, I play f5 immediately using this tactical opportunity. So remember that you always want to start with the most active opportunity. F5 is such a move because it creates a threat of just promoting. And if you take it, there will be knight d4 with a fork and you lose your bishop. Black took here on h4, trying to at least create some counterplay, but now f6, and this is a very useful thing to remember. The bishop can never handle two passers on the opposite sides of the board. He can be placed here, which controls both of the squares, but once I push both of my pawns, by the way, it's important, even still here, not to think that, well, it doesn't matter, I can play whatever I want. You always have to watch out for your opponent's counterplay. Thank God it's still winning for me. But along with those pawns, I cannot win, because if I play f7, then he's still in time to catch this pawn. And if I go the other way around a7, then he's still in time to take this pawn, and I lose all of my advantage. But I start with an active move first. I create a threat, because a6 by itself does not create any threats, and knight c3 does. So you always want to start with the most active opportunities, checks, captures, and threats. Knight c3 is a threat, and the bishop has to decide which direction you want to go. And either way, you're not going to control both of the pawns as a result. So yeah, my opponent resigned here in a few moves because you cannot stop the pawns, and his counterplay is way too slow. Even though my student is really advanced, he's almost 2200 elo-rated player, if you apply enough pressure, eventually he made those mistakes and he lost the game. So this is exactly the strategy I want you to apply in every single endgame you're gonna play after this video. If chess feels tough for you, in this video I have prepared for you a strategy that is gonna help you simplify it all. From move number 1 till the end of the game, I share powerful tips of how you can play chess, enjoy the game, and score so many more points.